In 622, Muhammad left Mecca and migrated to Medina, which becomes the beginning of the Hijri calendar. This is attested by a papyrus from Egypt dating to the year 22 of the Hijrah, which would be about the year 642 or so, or 642, 643. And it's a bill of sale for 100 sheep that's written on one side in Greek and on the other side in Arabic. And it mentions the date of the Hijrah, the year 22. And since the Hijrah dating system was only established in the year 18, 4 years before that, that is indeed an early document, an early papyrus. So this became an event that is very foundational in Islam as the moving away from Mecca. To some extent, the Muslim tradition, although it has never denied the expulsion of the Muslims from Mecca and the confiscation of their property, which is mentioned in the Quran, for example, in the verses that I gave you there and also in some other verses. But it de-emphasizes this because it doesn't want, the Muslim tradition does not want to de-emphasize the agency of the Prophet and does not want to portray him as a kind of a refugee, but rather make the timing of the migration being of his own choice and so on, so that they were already going because they had prepared the place. But it's quite clear that the Meccans expelled them and confiscated their property. And that meant the Muslims and their families who were going to Medina, who were about 80 households, were destitute when they arrived there. So it was just a little group that was like a, charismatic religious grouping that was 80 families at that time. This is Mount Fower, where the Prophet hid in a cave while escaping from Mecca because the Quraysh were said to have planned to kill him when he was thought to be escaping. This is another picture of Mount Fower. So that's still shown there. This is a picture of Medina, which illustrates several features of the city that emerged there. One of them is the wall. Another is the Prophet's mosque in it, where you have the green dome over the Prophet's tomb and the minaret next to the dome, which is called the primary minaret, and Al-Madinah Ra'isiyah. And even though this dome and this whole thing might appear to be very ancient, that dome was actually only constructed in 1860 after the followers of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the Saudis from Najd had destroyed the previous dome. And then beyond it, you can kind of see the date groves of Medina, because unlike Mecca, Medina had vast forests of date palms that it generally lived off of. So here you see a panorama of these date groves. You probably can't see the distinction there too well, but it's because they're darker colored than the desert would be. This picture may be from about 1907. And it shows how small the city was then. Here's the close-up, which illustrates the date groves. You can see the date groves toward the southeast. So in order to take care of the problem that normally bad relations would tend to break out between people of different tribes if they were crammed together, and that the Meccans arrived destitute, the Prophet paired up the destitute migrating Meccans with wealthy Medinans. And so he took each Meccan and said, "You are the brother of so-and-so amongst the Medinans," taking the Medinans who had the wherewithal to support them. And this was called the brothering, al-mu'akha, and each Medinan became responsible for the Meccan exactly like a full brother. And that way, the problem of tribal clashing was overcome for the time being. And then a meeting was held with other people in the oasis, which was an area about 6 miles square, so about 36 square miles, consisting of date groves. It had no city in it. It had no town in it. Rather, the people each lived in their own place. So I looked in vain on the internet for a map of it. I know where I can get one and scan it and put it up on the internet myself, but evidently nobody has done that. But this is schematic, of course. If we picture it like this, the whole oasis was divided into clan zones of the various clans inhabiting Medina that schematically could be represented something like that. And each clan had then exclusive right over their land and their part of the date groves, and there wasn't any center. I mean, there's this geographical center, but it didn't have any significance or any center in it. And some of the clans were more powerful than others of them, but they had all built themselves up into two alliances called Al-Khazraj and Al-Aus. And the Al-Khazraj were bigger than Al-Aus, and they were like the Axis and the Allies in World War II. And they were fighting a furious war called the War of Bu'ath. Now, when you have an oasis, and I just said that the inhabitants of Mecca were 5,000, how many people could have been living here? Well, by thinking of average population densities, we can calculate that, but it would be something on the order of 10 to 30,000 people at the most. In 30,000, that would just be on the outside, extremely the most possible. And probably it would be less rather than that. And so when you read numbers of things in the sources, they may be exaggerated. And nobody can take the Muslim sources and say, well, these numbers have to be validated exactly as they are. And usually with all study of ancient and medieval history, whenever you have a recording of how many people participated in a battle, and especially if it's a recording of the numbers of the enemy, you should automatically divide by 10. That would be a sound historical principle. To, just for starters, divide by 10. Now, particular arguments can be made against that. In the Battle of Badr, for example, where there are 313 Muslims exactly who are all named, and where those people shortly thereafter in the earliest caliphate received emoluments according to their participation. They're having participated in the Battle of Badr from the government, where the martyrs were very carefully recorded and so on. I would argue that the list of the Badr participants is exactly authentic. But that's like the first battle, the foundational battle. But elsewhere, you get sometimes ridiculous numbers. So like the worst being the Battle of Mu'tah, where you have, some sources say, 3,000 Muslims faced 100,000 Byzantines, which violates the rule that pre-modern armies could not exceed 30,000 in a place or a particular battle. And some of the versions have doubled the 100,000 to 200,000 enemies. And that sort of is like Herodotus, where you have the invasion of Xerxes had 2 million. And so modern historians reduced that to 200,000, and then they reduced it further to 180,000. And now skeptical historians think even 180,000 is dubious. Maybe 180,000 with all the ancillary support and the ships and the camp followers and so on. So anyway, this was the situation, and the attraction of moving to Medina for the Prophet to move to Medina from the aspect of the Medinans was to stop the war and unite them. And that's why the Prophet was invited there essentially to become the judge of the place. And one of the sensitivities when he arrived was that he would have to live somewhere, and that would be in somebody's territory. So that was solved by letting his camel, Al-Qaswa, simply wander around till she stayed or settled down in a particular place. And he said, okay, here on this spot I will build the mosque. And so that became the Mosque of Medina, and then the town grew around that. And that's how that was settled. And so in the meeting, a constitution was set down, which is considered the Constitution of Medina, establishing a law-governed community, recognizing that the Prophet Muhammad would be the judge. And so the people set up and agreed to him being the judge, but they did not agree that they would all join Islam. So he would be the judge for people who were Muslims and for non-Muslims. And therefore the Quran, in these particular verses in Surah 5, says, judge according to what has been sent down, and that judge them according to what has been sent down to them. And that's the explanation of that. And the Constitution, therefore, afforded a kind of religious equality between the citizens that later was left behind when the mastery of Islam in the Caliphate period became established. But it's still there on the books. So several religious developments happened. Prayer had already started in Mecca, but it was only in Medina that Jum'ah, the Friday prayer service, started. And that was actually started when Muhammad, shortly before he migrated to Medina, sent out Mus'ab ibn Umair to establish the Friday prayer there and give a sermon. And in 623, the month of fasting of month of Ramadan was revealed and began to be started. And the payment of zakat, the charity payment, also started about that time. So some institutionalizations of the religion that hadn't yet taken place started. And then, according to verses in Surah 5, alcoholic drinks, gambling, and games of chance were forbidden for the Muslims after a certain point.